Gearboxes are starting to pop up more and more in the mountain bike world. So today we thought we'd ride a gearbox transmission versus a regular transmission and see what all the fuss is about. We want to see how they ride, how different they are, and what actually do they offer you. Recently on GMBN Tech, we went to visit Starling Cycles to talk about gearboxes and actually question why the industry hasn't widely adopted them yet. It's a really cool video and it's in the link underneath if you want to watch that. It's been pretty popular. So off the back of that, we've actually borrowed a Starling Cycle with an Effigear gearbox on there, so we can actually ride one and kind of feel what the differences are compared to an external transmission. Now, a bit of a disclaimer here, there's no scientific testing. These are two very different bikes. I'm not comparing the bikes or anything else, purely the transmissions. So this Starling is a spur, it's got 170 millimeters of travel, it's got a single pivot and it's running the Effigear gearbox on there with 9 gears. This is my Canyon Spectral, it's running a 12-speed SRAM transmission on here. So a completely different setup. And it's got 150 millimeters travel, it's a trail bike and it's much lighter. So just take that into consideration for the rest of the video because I'm really just going to focus on these transmissions. Now, let's just bring you up to speed on what I've got on my bike and what's running on here, just so I can give you an idea of what I might be expecting. Now, although we've seen gearboxes come and go over the years, the derailleur and the cassette is still king as far as shifting in the cycling world goes. Now, why is that exactly when it's an external transmission and it's really susceptible to what is going on with the elements? And of course, if you smack that rear mech with a massive rock, you could easily damage it. Well, the truth is, they're cheap to produce, they're cheap to replace on the whole, not talking about individual components at higher levels here. They're very easy to maintain and they're very low in friction. Of course, when you're cycling, you've got to overcome friction. It's the single biggest factor other than air resistance to get past. You're turning this around, so the minimal friction you can have on a transmission, the better it's going to be for you. Now, this particular setup, we've got SRAM set up on here. It's actually an Access electronic shifting system, but that's irrelevant for this video. I'm just purely going to be talking about the fact we've got cogs on the back, we've got a derailleur on the back, we've got a chain, everything is exposed to the elements. Now, I've got 12 gears on here, a 10 tooth at the high end or the smallest end, and a 52 at the biggest end. So that's a 520% gear range. Like, it's a huge range of gears, and accordingly I just have a single chainring at the front. Now, this system works absolutely brilliantly, but there is something that everyone needs to take into account. When you're adding weight at the rear wheel here, you are affecting the suspension performance on the bike. Now, the main part of the frame is known as your sprung mass, and the wheels at either end are known as your unsprung mass. The lighter that your unsprung mass can be, the better your suspension is going to work. It really is that simple. Now, although this cassette is quite a high-end one, it's quite light, I'm sure you know well that you can get some extremely heavy rear cassettes. The heavier the cassette is, the more effect it has on your rear suspension performance. So that is something I'm going to be taking into account in today's video. Let's have a look at the other bike then, shall we? Okay, so this is the Starling Spur and it's using an Effigear gearbox. Now, pretty much at the moment, there's two major contenders in the gearbox realm. There's Pinion and there's Effigear. Now, the most significant difference between the two of them is on the Pinion gearboxes, the actual transmission runs around the crank arm itself. Whereas on here, you can see the bottom bracket is separate to where the actual transmission runs. So effectively, you can set this up like a high pivot design, as you're seeing on this single pivot, high pivot bike. It's kind of like the idler wheel essentially, but that's part of the gearing transmission. So that in itself gives the designers the freedom to make a bike that has very little or zero chain growth on it. So you're going to have a very effective suspension system. So that alone is quite a cool thing. Add on to the fact you've got no derailleur, you've got no cassette, you've got no additional weight on the rear of the bike, and you're actually lowering your unsprung mass. And you're putting that weight here instead. So the weight's still on the bike, it's not like you remove it completely. But by having the weight on the sprung mass, the bike handles really quite differently. Now, if any of you have ridden an e-bike, you've probably noticed the suspension feels amazing on them. That is because the sprung mass is so heavy because of the motor and the battery. This will have a similar effect, not quite the same scale, but by reducing everything at the rear, you will get that same effect. Now the gearbox itself, this one actually has 9 gears on it, so far less than the 14 on my bike, and it's got a 440% gear range on there. The really cool thing about a gearbox bike is the fact that the gears are fully sealed on the inside and they're running in oil. This has 2 major effects. One of them, 0 maintenance. Yeah, right, that's probably the coolest thing about a gearbox. They say it's something like 10,000 kilometers you can run this before you just drain out the oil and replace the oil. Insane, 10,000 kilometers before even lubing the stuff. All you've really got to do is lube the chain and go and ride again. Absolutely amazing. The downside though, is you're turning those gears in oil. So think about it, you're adding friction before it gets to your rear wheel. Now it's a well-known factor that any gearbox style system will have additional friction. This is kind of the Achilles heel really, and you have to balance out whether the riding attributes and what it offers outbalances that for you. So when it comes to pedaling up the steeper hills, I mean, undeniably there is more friction. You can certainly feel it in the transmission, but it's pretty consistent to be fair. And I've got to say, like, this isn't a bike that's geared up for climbing, so it's kind of unfair of me to judge it on that. But when you ride it side by side against a regular geared transmission, you can kind of see why this sort of technology hasn't quite developed and made it towards the mass market with trail bikes. But for a longer travel bike like this, where you haven't got things like a rear derailleur to break off if you're sessioning bike parks, I see no reason why you wouldn't want to adapt something like this. The suspension feels unreal with it. The rear end, I mean the rear wheel's no lighter than what's on my bike, and it feels so much lighter. You notice it really being active, and that's nothing to do with the suspension or the core shot. It's really to do with the lack of weight on that rear hub. Makes a massive difference. Pretty impressed so far. Okay, thoughts so far, completely mixed actually. So when I first got on this, I thought, wow, there is a substantial amount of friction you've got to overcome. And I thought that more noticeably in the lowest gear, but actually just behind you, I've just ridden up like sort of a push-up bit to descend through the woods a couple of times. The more you ride it, the quicker it goes away. It's actually quite surprising. Now, I actually would have said, yeah, I can 100% notice the difference between the two. And you can when you back to back it, but when you dial into something, it is bizarre how fast you become desensitized to that, if that makes sense. But probably the most overriding feeling that I'm getting on this bike is actually how well that rear suspension works. And again, the bike has a good suspension platform, it's got a good core shock, but it's not about that. I'm talking about the lack of weight on the rear wheel. It's so noticeable. And I don't just mean when you're clapping through rocks and you can literally feel the back end tracking the ground. It's bizarre. It handles much more like a downhill bike would in a more trail friendly platform. I mean, this is a heavy duty bike, don't get me wrong. This is designed for hammering out alpine runs and stuff, but it's a really bizarre feeling. You've got so much grip on the rear end and the bike is completely silent. There's no cassette whizzing around, there's no chain slapping. No matter how much you try and silence a modern mountain bike, I've got stuff all over my Canyon, but it still makes noise. The chain will still tap away on the inside of the chain guide. There's literally nothing on this. And actually there is something that I'm finding a bit unnerving about it that I didn't expect, is the fact the bike is so silent. You can hear everything. You can hear your traction. Now, I've always ridden without headphones and like open face helmets because I like to be able to feel the breeze on my face and hear what's going on with the bike underneath me. But this is the next level of that. It's really, really quite bizarre. You can hear every little scratch and scurf that the tyres are making on the terrain that's normally masked by your freewheel on your rear hub, or your chain slapping around, or all these things that you won't actually notice until you ride something like this. All right, well, it's really day and night difference between the two. So jumping back onto my bike, yeah, all right, it does feel loads lighter than that, but weirdly, the back end doesn't feel much lighter, even though the bike physically is loads lighter. That's testament, I think, to taking the cassette and rear derailleur off the bike, essentially. But yeah, this dances around a way I'm familiar with, but the thing I really notice is being able to change gear when I want. So, as we all know, derailleur gears, we've been using them since the dawn of time, yeah? So we're used to changing gear and having to sort of relax as you're pedaling a little bit, just to sort of ease up as the chain can hop either way. So familiar, so in tune with it. When I'm riding a styling without Effie gear on it, there's a few things about it. So you can change gear anytime you want. You don't have to be pedaling. That's the beauty of a gearbox, because the way the gears are aligned. When you change gears on a derailleur set bike, you've got to wait for the chain to actually hop up or down. So there is a delay and you have to pedal. But we manage that delay because we're so used to it. I'm not used to the sort of the instant gear change thing. And there's two things about it I'm not sure about. So one of them, when you tap down through the gears into a higher gear, it feels like it's almost changed gear before you've even finished tapping gear. It's so instant. That's amazing. I absolutely love that. But the thing that I struggle with initially, and I think this is the muscle memory thing, is changing into a lower gear. You can't really do it under much pressure. It just doesn't seem to want to play ball. You kind of got to preempt when you want to change gear and either relax slightly, or maybe you're going into a switchback and up into a turn and you're turning back uphill. I've been caught out where I've changed into too low a gear or not quite the right gear and just not got it right. And don't get me wrong, I think you would relearn those things, but I mean, it would take me a long time to relearn that, having had changing gear, like the muscle memory of that just in my life for so long. It's not a bad thing, it's just so different to compare. So the efficiency between the two is definitely something noticeable in different areas when you're riding. Now, at the top of some of the runs, getting the bike up to speed, obviously this, bang through the gears, you know where you are. On the bike with the Effie gear, it's very different. Yeah, super positive, banging down through those gears into the harder gears, but you can definitely feel friction there in the transmission, more friction than you can with this, I'm certain of it. But it's not really a problem because gravity has been your friend and it's just not really a place where you notice it. We haven't done any riding on the flat here as such, to, it's quite gravity, you're either up or you're down, to notice it, and I do reckon that you would notice the difference on the flat. But on the climbs, this is where there's a bit of a surprise. Now, if you're putting loads of torque through the system, it makes a bit of noise and you can feel friction. But if you're sitting and spinning, like on this is actually an e-bike climb, I'm pretty much nearly in the lowest gear on both bikes, there's not much difference. And then adding to the fact, something that people never talk about when they compare the two. So with internal transmissions like a gearbox, you know that everything's going to run exactly the same, wet or dry, muddy, snow, whatever's going on outside is protected in oil on the inside. Your external transmissions work amazingly when they're dry and they're lubed and they're clean. As soon as you get mud and stuff on them, everything changes. I reckon there's not much difference on a climb like this when it's muddy to running a gearbox bike. I reckon they're probably pretty similar. Well, that was a pretty interesting day riding. So we're obviously at a bike park. This is Bike Park Wales. It's lift access trails or you pedal up. And actually for that sort of riding, pretty good bike for that. Pretty good setup with the gearbox on there. Now, some observations about running the two back to back. Now, it's far too early just on a day's riding to tell how you'd get on with learning to navigate using that system. And what I mean by that is just your muscle memory, get used to shifting. Several times I messed up, but it's purely that I'm so used to running conventional derailleurs, so it's not a negative about the FE gear system or the pinion system for that matter. But the positives, I mean, there's loads of them. So this bike is substantially heavier than my Canyon, right? It's a bigger travel bike, so this is not a negative thing, but I'd say it's probably about 4 pounds heavier, and yet it feels so much lighter on the ground. Right, now that is because of the unsprung mass. The way the suspension is working on the bike, irrelevant to the actual suspension units on there, I'm talking about how light that back end is and the way it tracks the ground, and the fact that you've got the weight that was your derailleur and your cassette stuff on the centre of the bike. It makes a massive difference. Having the extra weight on the centre of the bike, you don't necessarily notice that, it's removing the weight from the wheels. And I'm blown away. It feels amazing. It's deadly quiet. If you like a quiet bike, then maybe that's the setup you want to look at. Now, the friction side of things, as we mentioned at the beginning, there's probably, I think they said about 5% more friction. You think you're pedaling gears that are connected together through oil before that power gets to your rear wheel. There's going to be more friction. Is it a problem? For this sort of riding, absolutely not. Like, that is pretty much a really good setup for this sort of riding. As Joe from Starling Cycles intended. He's designed it as a super enduro, lift access, alpine, uplift day bike. Like, that is just sort of your platform for it. But for trail riding, I mean, not that you'd ride a bike without much travel for trail riding, but I think I'm going to need to revisit this because the friction between the two systems was noticeable when I was really cranking, but when I was spinning, just going up the fire roads for access, I've got to say, there wasn't a massive thing in it. And if you only had a bike with a gearbox, I'm not sure you'd even notice it. You just tune into it. Is that good enough for you? Along with the 10,000 kilometers between servicing? I mean, there's lots of other things to do this. You'd have to invest in a new bike completely to house the gearbox on and stuff. You can't just bolt one onto an existing bike. But I think I would like to experiment a bit further and try something a bit less travel. Around 150, something that I'm really familiar with, and take it for some rides on familiar terrain. And then I think I'd really know and understand how the gearbox works and essentially if it offers me anything. I mean, I think it's been a really interesting day's riding, just running the two back to back. But I've got to say, I can't get away from the fact that I can bang through the gears because I'm so familiar with them. And really, although it is a bit of an Achilles heel, having a derailleur hanging off the bike, I haven't smashed one off for quite some time now, and the system works pretty admirably. So I don't think at this stage either is better. They're both for different riders for different purposes, but it's good. It's good food for thought. I'm glad I actually took Joe's tip and actually came out for a ride on the bike. It's been a good day. I'd love to hear from you if you've ridden a gearbox or if you've got one on your bike. And I'd like to know what sort of setup you've got. Have you used something like Kindone? Have you got the pinion? Are you running an FE gear like this? Where do you think it's going to go? Let's try and push this on a bit. I think it's really interesting, this topic. Pretty open-ended. Sorry about that, but I've had a great day. And I want to see if I can squeeze in another run before it gets too dark. But hopefully you enjoyed the video. And I'll see you in the next one. See you later.